Hosea, the love that defied betrayal. Imagine being in a relationship where, no matter how much you dedicate yourself, the other person always finds a way to betray your trust. Painful, right? Now, imagine that even in the face of repeated betrayals, you choose to keep loving, forgiving, and calling that person back, day after day. Seems impossible? For God, this is a constant reality. And no one better to illustrate this than the prophet Hosea. His life was a living metaphor of God's unconditional love for a people who constantly betrayed him. A love that defied all human logic and showed that, even when Israel, and we, fail, God remains faithful. Here's the question that may even sound controversial. What if betrayal isn't the end? What if failure could be the path to something even greater? In a world where we are taught to abandon what doesn't work, Hosea's story shows us a completely different perspective. He tells us about a God who, instead of giving up, insists on restoring. And what's even more impressive is that this love is not just a distant idea, but a reality that directly impacts our lives today. Have you ever stopped to think how many times God has extended his hand, even when we were at our lowest? What makes this narrative so engaging is the fact that, deep down, we've all experienced some form of betrayal, whether in a relationship, a friendship, or even in our own personal failures. The pain of being unfaithful to yourself, your principles, or even to God is real. But here's the point: the solution has always been God's restoring love. And the great truth is that this love defies the rules we know. It doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for a heart willing to return. No matter how many times you've fallen, what matters is the decision to get up and return to the covenant. Curious to understand more about this love that knows no limits? This is the central theme of Hosea's story, and I invite you to dive into this transformative lesson. Together, let's explore how this ancient message can revolutionize the way we see our relationships, our failures, and most importantly, the grace that restores us every day. Hosea's marriage to Gomer, a metaphor for God's relationship with Israel. Hosea, a prophet living in one of Israel's most turbulent times, received an unusual task: marry Gomer, a woman known for her unfaithfulness. This marriage was a living metaphor of God's relationship with Israel, where the people constantly broke the sacred covenant through idolatry. Imagine a marriage where trust was broken countless times, yet love, incredibly, never ceased to exist. Just like Israel, Gomer would stray, but Hosea, symbolizing God's relentless love, would bring her back. Who hasn't felt that they failed in a relationship but found a second chance to rebuild it? The story of Hosea and Gomer teaches us about forgiveness and a perseverance that seems impossible in today's world. Think about it. How often do we see relationships break down due to distrust or emotional and spiritual betrayals? And yet, there is a call for reconciliation. In the context of God and Israel, it wasn't just a one-time mistake but repeated acts of infidelity. Even so, the prophet shows us that with genuine love, redemption is possible. It invites us to reflect on our own covenants, whether with God, with our partners, or even with ourselves. And you might be wondering, but is it really worth forgiving so many times? The answer this narrative gives is clear. True love is persistent, and often requires you to go beyond what seems logical. This doesn't mean accepting everything, but having the wisdom to understand when a relationship, whether with God, with others, or with yourself, can be restored. At its core, the story of Hosea and Gomer challenges us to go against the current of today's world, which often preaches the quick disposal of everything, including commitments. As you connect with this story, the idea of love and covenant deepens. And it leads us to think, how far does our own faithfulness go? Are we like Gomer, always seeking something more than what we already have? Or are we willing to return, just as Israel was called to return to God? This reflection expands into the next topic, where the focus shifts to God's love, which never fails, even in the face of the most severe betrayals. God's love for the unfaithful, messages of forgiveness and restoration. Amid all the betrayals and unfaithfulness of Israel, something stands out: God's unwavering love. Even when the people repeatedly broke the covenant, God continued to offer forgiveness and restoration. This is one of the deepest messages Hosea conveys. Imagine being in a relationship where the other person constantly makes mistakes, strays away, and returns as if nothing happened. Most people would give up, but God? He stands firm, showing that His love is much greater than any mistake. It's like when someone you deeply love wrongs you, but something inside you says it's still worth investing in that relationship. The beauty of divine forgiveness is that it knows no bounds. Just as Hosea sought out Gomer, God always extends His hand to Israel, even when they abandon Him to worship idols. This love goes beyond human understanding, challenging our notions of justice. How many times in our own lives have we sought mercy from someone, or even from God, hoping for a second chance? And how often have we found it? The book of Hosea reminds us that restoration is always available, as long as we are willing to accept it. It challenges us to be agents of forgiveness and reconciliation. If we think practically, this message can apply to various areas of our lives. Perhaps you have a broken relationship, a severed family tie, or you're dealing with personal failures that seem unforgivable. What Hosea teaches us is that the first step to restoration is recognizing that forgiveness is possible. And often, what's most needed to restore these connections is the willingness to open ourselves to forgiveness. For instance, in a workplace environment, how many times can a sincere apology change the course of a relationship between colleagues? Or in a romantic relationship, how many times can a gesture of reconciliation reignite a flame that seemed extinguished? But of course, God's forgiveness doesn't happen without repentance. He forgives, yes, but He expects a change in behavior, a return to the original covenant. Divine love, shown so clearly in the book of Hosea, is transformative. It doesn't leave us the same as it found us. And as we delve deeper into this story, we see that this transformation is complete, always guided by God's desire to see His people restored. The next step in this journey is understanding the warnings Hosea gave against idolatry, the great cause of Israel's unfaithfulness. Warnings against idolatry, Hosea's call for faithfulness to God. One of the main reasons for Israel's unfaithfulness was its inclination towards idolatry. In Hosea's time, the people were constantly worshipping foreign gods, forming alliances with nations that practiced pagan worship. The prophet didn't mince words in warning them. He was clear and direct. Idolatry was a betrayal of the covenant with God. It's like being in a relationship where someone constantly looks outside for what they already have at home. Hosea urged Israel to understand the seriousness of this betrayal. Every time the people bowed to an idol, they were saying that God wasn't enough. Idolatry, in fact, isn't just about worshipping statues or foreign gods. It reflects something deeper, the attempt to find security and purpose outside of God. This can be translated to today's context in various ways. How many times do we place our hopes in material things, in people, or even in ourselves, instead of trusting in something greater? Today, idolatry can take the form of obsession with success, power, or even status. These things, when placed above our faith, end up replacing God's place in our lives. Hosea, as a wise mentor, warned Israel that this relentless pursuit of false gods would lead them to judgment. He urged the people to return to faithfulness, to realize that their covenant with God was the only thing that could truly sustain them. In our times, this translates into the need to reevaluate where we're placing our trust. Are we seeking security in fleeting things? Like Israel, we may be surrounded by distractions competing for our attention and devotion. And often these distractions pull us away from what truly matters. Just as a healthy relationship requires focus and dedication, so does our spiritual covenant. If we stop to think, modern-day idolatry can be found everywhere. At work, when we place professional success above all else, or in our personal lives, when we believe that only relationships or material possessions can bring us happiness. Hosea calls us to reflect on these choices and reconsider where we're investing our time and devotion. And this reflection leads us to the next inevitable point, God's judgment. When the people of Israel didn't heed the warnings, judgment came. And this opens the way to understand Hosea's prophecies about the consequences of unfaithfulness. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like the video. God's judgment on Israel, prophecies of destruction and repentance. When Hosea's warnings were ignored, the inevitable happened: God's judgment fell upon Israel. The prophet, in his words full of authority, spoke of the destruction that was coming. It wasn't a matter of punishment for pleasure, but a response to Israel's continued departure from the sacred covenant. God, in his justice, needed to correct the course of his people, and judgment was the only way to bring about that correction. It's like when a parent has to impose limits on a disobedient child to help them understand the seriousness of their actions. Love is present, but so is the necessity to show the consequences. Hosea foretold difficult times, exile, the destruction of cities, and the collapse of a nation that had once enjoyed divine protection. These prophecies weren't empty threats but an urgent call to repentance. Judgment was imminent, yet repentance still had the power to change Israel's destiny. Here, we see something powerful about God's character. Even in the moment of judgment, He offers a chance for redemption. How often in our own lives do we face moments of crisis, only to realize that these crises are opportunities to reevaluate our choices? Judgment doesn't come solely as destruction but as a path toward restoration. If we bring this concept into our reality, how many times do we ignore warning signs in our own lives until something forces us to stop and reflect? It could be a financial difficulty, a relationship crisis, or a health problem. These moments of judgment often make us reconsider the path we're on. Hosea's message is clear: repentance is always an option, but it needs to be genuine and come before the destruction arrives. Repentance is not just about feeling regret, but about changing direction, just as Israel was called to do. However, the prophet also made it clear that judgment wasn't the end of the story. God, in His infinite mercy, wouldn't completely abandon His people. Judgment was coming, yes, but along with it came the possibility of a better future. This is the cycle repeated throughout Israel's history: unfaithfulness, judgment, repentance, and finally, restoration. Judgment wasn't the end but a necessary part of the process. And this leads us to the next chapter in Hosea's journey, his ongoing ministry in the northern kingdom, where he continued to call the people back to God despite everything. Hosea's ministry in the northern kingdom, calling a rebellious people back to God. Even in the midst of chaos and widespread disobedience, Hosea persisted in his calling. In the northern kingdom, he continued his mission, crying out for the people's repentance. The task wasn't easy. Imagine preaching to a crowd that seems deaf to your pleas, like a mentor trying to guide someone who refuses to listen. Yet Hosea, driven by love and divine purpose, didn't give up. His message of repentance and a return to the covenant with God echoed through the streets, challenging Israel to abandon its rebellion. Hosea knew his mission was greater than the people's stubbornness. If we take a moment to reflect, Hosea's attitude teaches us about the importance of perseverance. How often do we face situations where we feel our efforts are in vain? Whether it's trying to help someone improve their life, change a habit, or even bringing a friend back to the path of faith, what we can learn from Hosea is that giving up is not an option. A true mentor knows that the words planted today may bloom tomorrow, even if the soil seems barren now. It's like a teacher continuing to invest in a difficult student, believing that, eventually, they will understand the lesson. Moreover, Hosea's ministry in the northern kingdom was a living testament to God's patience. Despite the people's constant waywardness, God used His prophet to keep calling them back. This shows us that, often, the deepest changes take time to happen. Maybe you're dealing with a situation where progress seems slow, almost non-existent. Yet the story of Hosea reminds us that the important thing is to keep planting the right seeds. The results may not be immediate, but the harvest will come at the right time. At the same time that Hosea continued his preaching, he also announced that God's mercy wouldn't fail. Even in the midst of chaos and rebellion, there was a promise of restoration. This was the great consolation Hosea brought to the people: exile and destruction wouldn't be the end. God had bigger plans, and Israel's redemption was in sight. The road would be difficult, but there was hope on the horizon. And this hope manifested in the prophecy of Israel's restoration, the next major point in Hosea's narrative. The prophecy of Israel's restoration, hope after exile. Despite all the warnings of destruction and judgment, Hosea never stopped conveying a message of hope. He prophesied that after the exile and the fall of Israel, there would be restoration. This is the great contrast in the book of Hosea: severe judgment followed by the promise of redemption. Imagine the heart of a father who, after correcting his child, welcomes them back with open arms, ready to start anew. In the same way, God promised to restore Israel, to raise it up again, and to bring it back to His love. Once again, God's mercy would prevail over judgment. This prophecy teaches us that, no matter how difficult things may seem, there is always hope for a new beginning. All of us, at some point, go through phases where we feel everything has fallen apart, that the mistakes we've made have taken us to a point of no return. But Hosea's story reminds us that with God, exile, whether literal or symbolic, is never the end. When it seems like there's nothing left to do, He offers us the opportunity to rise and start again. For Israel, restoration meant returning home and rediscovering their identity as God's chosen people. Interestingly, this restoration wasn't just physical but also spiritual. Israel wouldn't simply return home. They would renew their covenant with God. This promise of restoration challenges us to reflect on our own lives. What do we need to restore? Perhaps it's a broken relationship, a faith that's been lost along the way, or even our self-confidence. Hosea's message tells us that it's never too late to start over. And for those seeking restoration, the first step is always to return to God, just as Israel was called to do. Looking to the future, Hosea envisioned a time when Israel would once again be God's beloved people, without the stains of idolatry and unfaithfulness. This vision of a restored future reminds us that God's grace is infinite and always available. Even though the road is long and the process painful, redemption is guaranteed for those who turn back to Him. At this point in the story, we see that God's love knows no limits. God's unconditional love, which underpins this entire narrative, is the central message of Hosea and prepares us to better understand this great mystery. God's unconditional love, the central message of the book of Hosea. At the heart of Hosea's story lies a powerful truth: God's unconditional love. This love, which remains steadfast even in the face of Israel's deepest betrayals, is the theme that permeates the entire book. Imagine a love that isn't shaken by failures and isn't exhausted by disappointments. God, just as Hosea relentlessly sought Gomer, continues to call Israel back, regardless of how many times the people stray. This is the love that Hosea reveals, a love that goes beyond human comprehension, a covenant that will never be broken, no matter the circumstances. God's unconditional love challenges how many people view relationships today. In modern society, it's common for bonds to break at the first sign of difficulty, and for promises to be forgotten when the first storms arise. But what the book of Hosea teaches us is that true love, the kind that comes from God, endures and restores. Even when everything seems lost, God offers the chance for redemption. This truth is not just a theological lesson but something applicable to daily life. Who hasn't needed a second chance? Whether in a relationship, a career, or even our spiritual journey, there are always moments when we fail and need this love that accepts us back. Hosea's message about God's unconditional love also invites us to reflect on how we love. Are we capable of forgiving and continuing to love, even when we've been hurt? This kind of love isn't easy to practice, but it's the example God gives us. In our daily lives, we can apply this lesson in our personal relationships, whether with family, friends, or colleagues. Unconditional love is the kind that doesn't build barriers but bridges. It's a love that doesn't give up easily. And just as God doesn't give up on us, we are called not to give up on those we love. Finally, the central message of the book of Hosea is one of hope and restoration. God's love isn't conditional on Israel's perfection, just as it isn't conditional on our own perfection. This love transcends failures and weaknesses and welcomes us in any circumstance. When we understand this, we are transformed. Hosea's invitation is clear: accept this love and allow it to shape us. And so, the cycle of unfaithfulness, judgment, and redemption continues to show us that God's love will always be greater than any failure. This message then leads us to reflect on how we apply this love in our own lives, opening the way for an engaging conclusion. After understanding the depth of God's unconditional love revealed through Hosea's life, the question remains, how can you apply this knowledge in your own life? Is there someone you've given up on investing in? Or maybe it's your own spiritual walk that needs a return? The truth is, we all face moments of betrayal, whether from others, from ourselves, or in our relationship with God. But what this story teaches us is that, no matter the failures, love can always be restored, as long as there's a genuine desire to return. Now, the challenge is laid before you. What will you do with this message? Can you forgive and seek reconciliation, even when it seems impossible? Think about an area of your life that's broken. It could be a relationship that needs restoration, a part of you that's lost focus, or even your faith that's weakened along the way. God's love, as revealed in Hosea, shows us that there's always a chance to start again. Are you willing to take that step? To seek what was lost, to forgive what hurt you, and to return to the covenant that awaits you. And to keep growing in this journey, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, we continue exploring stories that not only impact but transform. Each video is an opportunity for you to learn something new and apply it to your life. Together, we'll discover how these lessons can change the way we see the world and, most importantly, how we live out our relationship with God. So, are you ready to follow this path of restoration and redemption? If so, you know where to find us for the next lesson. If you want to continue learning from these transformative stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll stay updated on each new teaching that can impact your life and your relationship with God. Let's continue this journey of faith together.